Well, I want to thank our panelists in the first panel for really just a terrific set of remarks, and also thank those of you who are in the, I'll just refer to you as the audience or the classroom today, for terrific questions. And this is exactly what we envisioned for this conference, and so Gary and I are both very grateful for that. Our next panel is going to be led by Ethan Alexander Davey, who's to my left, and he's going to introduce our two panelists. I just want to mention that Ethan is the postdoctoral fellow at the Marshall Center this year. So please welcome Ethan.
We have two very distinguished speakers for you. John O'Sullivan is a journalist, author, lecturer, and broadcaster. He is editor-at-large of National Review magazine, where he served as editor-in-chief for almost a decade. In 1987 to 88, he served as a special advisor to Lady Thatcher in Downing Street, and he also assisted in the writing of her memoirs. His book, The President, the Pope, and the Prime Minister, highlighted the roles played by Pope John Paul, President Ronald Reagan, and Prime Minister Thatcher in the collapse of communism. Our other speaker is John Bolton, who was appointed as United States Permanent Representative to the United Nations on August 1st, 2005, and served until his resignation in December 2006. Prior to his appointment, Ambassador Bolton served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security from May 2001 to May 2005. Ambassador Bolton currently serves as a Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Both of our speakers will give their remarks and, for about half an hour each, and when they're finished, we'll open the floor to questions.
Thank you very much. You need to slim slightly. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Chairman, thank you for that kind introduction, and I'd like to express my thanks along with those of all my colleagues to Brenda, to Gary, and to the organization, to Dan, for bringing us here. It's a marvelous campus. I've been, well, as you probably noticed, I was provoked into asking a lot of questions myself, so it's obviously an extremely lively occasion, and I'm grateful to be here. Margaret Thatcher died in April 2013. She's still very close to us. I mean, historical judgments about her are likely to be still controversial. But it's clear that, as your conference title suggests, she left a legacy. Now, that's not as normal, let alone as inevitable as you might suppose. Very few prime ministers leave anything that could be called a legacy. In the last century, Churchill did so, ditto Clement Attlee. Perhaps that would have been true of Edward Heath if Britain had not voted to leave the European Union. But Anthony Eden, Sir Alec Douglas-Home, Harold Wilson, Jim Callaghan, John Major, Tony Blair may have done good and bad things in their time in office, but they can hardly lay claim to an equal legacy of achievement, one that significantly changed Britain, unless the word's meaning is taken to mean serious failures and misjudgments and little else. Now, not that Mrs Thatcher's record is without its failures and misjudgments. The poll tax was a serious domestic policy failure. Her opposition to German reunification, a serious misjudgment in foreign policy. She failed to correct the policy of shadowing the Deutschmark early enough, with negative consequences for the economic success of her third term and indeed her time in office. Her legacy was therefore mixed, but its balance, in my view, is strongly positive. When we think of privatization, the Falklands War, the reform of trade union law, the defeat of the miners' strike, and much else, it's undeniable that her prime ministership had a significant impact on Britain, both for good and ill. In my opinion, good heavily predominating. One substantial and early proof of this is the number of books written about her. In the year after her death, 3 new full-dress biographies appeared. Earlier biographies, notably the 1-volume compression of John Campbell's 2 volumes, have been revised and republished. Her own memoirs have been republished in single-volume form. Other political studies and economic studies of Thatcher and Thatcherism are produced at regular intervals. At least 2 books substantially about her have been published or republished recently by speakers at this conference, not including my own. And David Cannondine's recently published DNB book has a bibliography that is far more extensive than I had ever imagined. And then there are movies, at least 2, innumerable documentaries, television plays, stage plays, and even several musicals, all revolving around her and her ideas. An amusing feature of these latter productions is that works intended to provide a hostile caricature of her end up by making her look either more successful, spitting images, or more sympathetic, the Iron Lady movie starring Meryl Streep. In many respects, she is the Frankenstein monster of the liberal left. Its caricature of her, Maggie the 100-foot tall woman, turns upon her creators and devours them regularly. This level of bipartisan interest shows she left a legacy. But what is it? If you want to understand, and others have made this point, the basic emotional drive of Margaret Thatcher and Thatcherism, it is to be found in some words she addressed to a television interviewer, Michael Cockrell, towards the close of the 1979 election campaign. With the campaign almost over, she let down her guard and she exclaimed, "I can't bear Britain in decline. I just can't bear it." Now this was a sincere outburst. It was also prophetic. Whatever else Thatcherism was, it was a politics designed to halt and reverse the decline of Britain. But let me remove right away a mistake about Thatcherism that is often made by sympathetic critics abroad. Her politics were not the simple application of an ideological blueprint to a historical blank sheet. They were practical solutions to practical problems, indeed to pressing economic problems that afflicted Britain in the late 1970s. Inflation, excessive union power, industrial decline, a rising military threat from the Soviet Union. Any government would have had to tackle them. Initially, therefore, reversing Britain's decline was seen by her in economic terms, because the most obvious problems were economic ones. Her remedies were cautious, flexible, responsive to these problems as they crossed the government's path, but also persisted in against strong opposition and great difficulties. They were drawn largely from the Anglo-Scottish tradition of classical liberal economics that had revived in England in previous years owing to the work of the Institute of Economic Affairs. But it was very natural that she should turn to that tradition. Classical liberal economics had been an important strand of conservative thinking for more than a century. It was an intellectually formidable tradition with answers to most of the problems facing the new government. And the most obvious rival set of solutions, namely a social democratic version of Keynesianism, had come to the end of its tether in the 1978-79 winter of discontent. Thatcherism in economics, therefore, looked like the new economic common sense. Yet Thatcherism was never purely economic. When British interests were challenged from other directions, as in the Falklands War and in the Cold War, Mrs Thatcher drew on other relevant traditions that were to hand, notably on a tough-minded realism and on a moralistic liberal internationalism that served to justify her patriotic purposes. That said, whether in economics or in foreign policy, Thatcherite impulses were not the final determinant of policy. If a fierce patriotism drove her, as it did, it was governed by a highly practical prudence. Her 2 central victories, the Falklands War and the miners' strike, one foreign, one domestic, illustrate this. She did not expect or plan for the Argentinian seizure of the islands, but a politics of national regeneration could hardly refuse such a challenge. Though she was annoyed by Alexander Haig's mediation efforts, she let them play out to the end. She took calculated risks, militarily and diplomatically, but only after she had digested the best expert advice. At several points, she offered concessions to Buenos Aires that she privately thought dangerous, Robin made this point, But she did so from the calculation that the Argentinian junta was too preoccupied with prestige to accept even a temporary withdrawal, and that the greater danger to Britain lay in obduracy on our part. All in all, she manoeuvred to victory as much as moving boldly towards it. Similarly, she surrendered to the miners' union demands in 1981, when she was informed that the nation had insufficient coal stocks to resist a strike. But she at once began preparations, including a build-up of coal stocks at power stations, to resist any strike later. When it came, 3 years later, she was prepared and she defeated it. These two outright victories ran counter to the usual post-war British politics of compromise and splitting the difference. Together, they established her domestic dominance, entrenched her economic and labour union reforms as the new consensus of British politics, and elevated her international profile. Admittedly, her domestic success was limited. It did not include the welfare state, where she left reform late, except for the health service reforms, nor did it include the European Union, where she was brought down in large part because she was beginning to question the European commitment ahead of her cabinet colleagues. Still, in the end, she created a new political consensus. Not quite what she wanted, but better than she had fought in 1979, and far better, perhaps, than if the Tories had continued drifting thoughtlessly leftwards and wetwards. In foreign affairs, Mrs Thatcher personally played a crucial role in helping other West European governments to resist the powerful peace movement of the 80s, and so getting US missiles stationed in Western Europe. She brought together, one point, Helmut Schmidt, she accepted that she would take a number of the missiles that had been destined for Germany because his own restive left wing in the Social Democratic Party was becoming restive. That's quite a big deal in my view. She brought together Reagan and Gorbachev in their crabwise dance towards ending the Cold War peacefully at the various summits of the mid to late 1980s. To be sure, Thatcher was the subordinate partner in the Reagan-Thatcher relationship on military and diplomatic policy. Given the relative size of their two economies and militaries, it could not have been otherwise. Indeed, she should also have been the junior partner in terms of economic influence too. Yet somehow, she hasn't been. Owen Harries, the distinguished Australian diplomat, sometime editor of the National Interest magazine in Washington, and incidentally, or rather not incidentally, a consummate realist in foreign policy, argues persuasively that Mrs Thatcher may well be regarded by history as the more important and influential economic reformer as between her and Reagan. Why so? Well, first, the recovery of the British economy in the 1980s was more impressive because it started from a lower economic point and occurred in a more left-wing country. Second, Thatcher had harder opposition to overcome. Her labour market deregulation, for instance, had to overcome resistance from timid Tory wets, as well as from Labour MPs. Third, the reforms had to overcome major non-parliamentary challenges from the labour unions. Most of all, of course, the miners' strike. Once the miners were defeated, however, the British economy joined the American one in providing demonstration effects of what free market reforms could accomplish in a short time. These experiments, that Reaganism and Thatcherism, overlapped, but they were close in terms of policy, but not identical. Tax cuts were America's principal intellectual export. Privatization was Britain's. Of the two, privatization turned out to be the more important one globally, since the third world and post-communist economies were burdened by large, inefficient state sectors. When privatization succeeded, as it did with surprising speed, the most unlikely converts took note. When I was working on my Reagan, John Paul Thatcher book, I found a marvelous unwitting tribute to the Iron Lady in the files of the Politburo. It was a conversation between Gorbachev and a visiting Italian communist. The Italian begins the conversation. A bureaucratic apparatus which serves itself has swelled. It is interesting that a certain similarity with your situation, which you call stagnation, can be seen here. Gorbachev replies, "Yes, Parkinson's law applies everywhere." Then the Italian continues, any bureaucratization encourages the apparatus to protect its own interests, and to forget about the citizens' interests. I suppose that is why the right's demands for reprivatization are falling on fertile ground in West European political opinion. For reasons like that, Thatcher, even more than Reagan, posed an economic challenge to the Soviet Union, which was either reform or fall further behind the capitalist West. The comparison between the British recovery after a decade, actually less than a decade, of free market economics and the continuing stagnation of the Soviet economy after 70 years of communism was simply too embarrassing to ignore. Gorbachev's perestroika was one result. Once perestroika was introduced, however, it very rapidly destroyed the communist system it was designed to save. And once the command economies of the Soviet bloc collapsed in 1989, revealing the extraordinary wasteland of state planning, it was the Thatcher model that the new democracies mainly sought to emulate. She, Reagan, and John Paul II were all heroes in post-communist Europe. But it was Thatcher to whom the new economy ministers, such as Czechoslovakia's Václav Klaus, Poland's Leszek Balcerowicz, and Estonia's Mard Laar, looked to as their model of how to reform a bankrupt socialist economy. That at least is what they say. And the more thoroughly that post-communist societies followed the Thatcher model, the more quickly their economies rose from the dead. It was not only in the post-communist world, however, that Margaret Thatcher was seen as an inspiration. Thatcherism had an important impact both in Africa and Asia. Privatization, the better control of public debt, lower taxes, and a reduction of barriers to trade and capital movements, these became the new conventional wisdom in ministries of finance around the globe. The overall result, globalization, became the watchword of World Bank and IMF reports. Mrs. Thatcher herself emerged in retirement as a kind of economic heroine of Asian capitalism, invited regularly by Asian governments and consulted by them. More important, the economic transformations in Asia brought literally billions of Asian workers out of subsistence economies into the global labor market. They created new middle classes around the world, they reduced grinding poverty, and, not irrelevantly, they cut the cost of living for Europe and North America, even as they lifted the standard of living for poor people in what used to be called the Third World. They occurred, in part at least, because Mrs. Thatcher had argued for these changes as early as 1974, implemented them from 1979 onwards, revived the British economy with them by 1986, did all these things in a large advanced economy within the constitutional constraints of a mature democracy, and made of them a new conventional wisdom by 1989. Mrs. Thatcher was not, of course, the sole influence on all of the above developments, but she was the contributory factor in all of them, and sometimes a highly influential one. Now, there are naturally points of view much more critical of the Thatcher legacy, and it is undoubtedly true that serious errors of economic policy were made. But they were far outweighed in the long run by the economic successes of Thatcherism, notably a sustained rise in productivity, which is the key economic statistic. Some of those successes were evident at the time. After all, she left Britain as the fourth largest economy. But the general and sustained improvement in Britain's economic performance continued through the Major and Blair administrations right up to the 2008 financial crash. On becoming Chancellor in 1997, Labour's Gordon Brown was given a Treasury briefing on the economy, which concluded with the words, "These are wonderful figures," to which he famously replied, "What do you want me to do? Send them a thank you note?" Even if the Lib Lab criticisms of Thatcher's pure economic legacy were correct, however, that would not, which they're not, obviously, that would not be a conclusive criticism of her overall record. Her privatization revolution, her safeguarding of constitutional democracy by her defeat of the miners, her victory in the Falklands War, her role along Reagan and Kohl in the defeat of communism, her trade union reforms, these and other changes she wrought were plainly both important and beneficial in political, in strategic, in constitutional terms, even if they had contributed nothing to economic improvement. I think one can sensibly mount criticisms of what she did, but it's simply impossible to maintain that her policies were substantial failures or disasters overall. The proof of that is that even when Labour and Liberal Democrat parties continue to dislike them, they do not propose their repeal or rejection. The exception to this list of agreed achievements, accepted achievements, is the European Union. Most of Mrs Thatcher's biographers and critics believe that her stance on Europe was a major historical error that her party and her country would see in retrospect as nostalgia run riot. She would be left behind by history and by Britain as it embraced a European future. And until the last year, it looked as though her critics might have been right. Her record on Britain and the European Union is often cited, even by friendly critics, as the largest single blot on an otherwise great career. As for unfriendly critics, here is the judgment of Ian Gilmore, a Tory grandee whom she fired from her first cabinet. I quote, "Although she signed the Single European Act, under which Britain sensibly pooled much sovereignty with her partners, Thatcher showed a deep-seated prejudice against the European community in all her meetings with ministers and officials, according to an advisor who was present. Nigel Lawson noted her truculent chauvinism in Europe, and Campbell considers Europe to have been the greatest failure of her premiership." The Campbell he mentions is John Campbell, a pretty firm-minded biographer whose picture of Thatcher on Europe shows a woman whose, quote, truculent chauvinism again, was held in check by the realities of office, but who in retirement finally allowed her prejudices to overcome her judgment. She seemingly reached this deplorable stage with the publication of her final book, Statecraft, which came up to the very brink of advocating withdrawal from the European Union. Campbell summarizes its arguments as follows. Europe, she had concluded, after years of trying, was, quote, fundamentally unreformable, unquote. It was, quote, an empire in the making, the ultimate bureaucracy, unquote, founded on humbug, inherently protectionist, intrinsically corrupt, essentially undemocratic, and dedicated to the destruction of nation states. It is, in fact, a classic utopian project, she wrote, a monument to the vanity of intellectuals, a program whose inevitable destiny is failure. That being so, she now called, as she had never done explicitly before, for a fundamental renegotiation of Britain's membership, and if that failed, as it was bound to do, for Britain to be ready to leave the Union and join the North American Free Trade Area instead, turning its back on the whole disastrous folly. That's page 797 of Campbell's volume, The Iron Lady. One could add that she had told several people privately, including Bill Cash and Charles Moore, that she would vote to leave the European Union if the opportunity arose. When Statecraft was serialized in the Times in 2003, the reaction of the political and media establishments was sulphurous. Campbell again. This time the consensus was clear, right across the political spectrum, that she had finally lost touch with reality. Her reading of history was denounced as blinkered nonsense, the option of renegotiation dismissed as a fantasy, the idea of withdrawal as simply impractical. In the Commons, Tony Blair challenged Ian Duncan Smith to disown her views. He was then the Tory leader. To talk about withdrawal, this is Blair, to talk about withdrawal and rule out the single currency, whatever the circumstances, is not an act of patriotism. It is an act of folly. Duncan Smith refused to disown her, but as Campbell points out, practically every other prominent Tory, respectable person, an important organisation, did so in extravagant terms, small-minded, xenophobic, Little Englander. It was made clear that Britain's membership of the EU was an unchangeable reality of Britain's future. Support for it was an establishment orthodoxy, and opposition to it eccentricity at best. Since she was leaving public life on medical advice, she was really no longer available to defend her own views. only a small number of political allies came to her defense, and they were duly caricatured as the awkward squad, losers, barrack room lawyers, fruitcakes, loonies, and the rest. It seemed with the emergence of David Cameron, and the self-styled modernisers to lead the Tory party 2 years later, that Euroscepticism was dead and would shortly be buried, along with Mrs Thatcher when her funeral took place, as it did in 2013. It was in this atmosphere that obituaries in 2013, attempting to sum up her career, usually concluded that Europe was the main issue where she had been wrong-footed by history. Those who sympathised with her on the question, as I did, tended to argue it was too early for such a confident verdict. Today, however, it looks as though she was both on the right side of history, not a phrase I like actually, but certainly ahead of her party. How did that happen? And what conclusions should we draw? One reason is that Mrs Thatcher always had much more support from the general population on Europe than from political and media elites. Opinion polls from the 1970s to I looked up these quite recently, opinion polls from the 1970s, from 77 to this year, showed always that a large segment of British opinion was Eurosceptic and supportive of UK withdrawal. That support fluctuated, only occasionally becoming a majority, but it never dipped for long below 30%. It was treated, however, by the media as a niche opinion, which served to keep it lower than I think fairer coverage would have done. But when the referendum took place, and the rules forced the media to give the Eurosceptic case a fairer coverage, it became a popular majority in less than 4 months, and Thatcher was an important symbol for its support. That was even truer for the Tory party than for the electorate at large. Euroscepticism had always been the opinion of most Tories in and out of Parliament. Their leadership, on the other, had been consistently Europhile. As a result, successive Tory leaders had to conceal from the rank and file their degree of commitment to the European idea. Their rhetoric was always more Eurosceptic than their policies and intentions. Thatcher had been the great exception. It was one reason why she had been so popular with the party faithful, and why the post-Thatcher leadership had either to crush her opposition or to recruit her memory in a false way. So the referendum, when it appeared, stretched Tory loyalty to David Cameron and the Europhile cabinet majority to the breaking point and beyond. Again, when the referendum result was declared, she was an obvious symbol and beneficiary of the peasants' revolt. Much the most important reason for the revival of Thatcher's reputation here, however, is that she increasingly proved to be right. Read the list of her criticisms of the European listed by Campbell above. Fundamentally unreformable, check. All its reforms so far are attempts to consolidate its founding errors. An empire in the making, the ultimate bureaucracy, check. The European Commission, an appointed bureaucracy, enjoys a monopoly power of initiating legislation, and the decisions of the EU's courts are as binding on national governments as any viceroys. Founded on humbug. Well, if humbug means false claims of superior virtues sustained by trickery, such as recycling the European Constitution rejected in referendums as a Lisbon Treaty not subject to referendums, that's almost a textbook description. Inherently protectionist, intrinsically corrupt, essentially undemocratic, well, I would say check, check, check. It hasn't actually been able to declare a budget for 20 years, publish a budget. Dedicated to the destruction of nation states, well, that's actually written on the packet. That's what, and it's endorsed with statements from numerous Eurocrats, most recently Jean-Claude Juncker. A classic utopian project, a monument to the vanity of intellectuals, a program whose inevitable destiny is failure. Well, I suppose I would have to concede that the destiny of the EU is not yet fully worked out. But the euro and refugee crises, both resulting directly from two of the EU's fundamental institutional reforms, both embarked upon for largely theoretical reasons, both threatening the welfare of millions of ordinary Europeans, both stretching the loyalty of EU governments to Brussels, both posing existential threats to the EU and indeed to Europe itself, yet both seemingly endless and unreformable. These certainly have the smell of utopia and, forgive me, the faculty lounge about them. In addition to being, both these crises, moreover, rose half a decade after Mrs Thatcher's criticisms of the institutions and policy that had produced them. In addition to being a shrewd critic, therefore, she also counts as a highly prescient seer. Compare that record with those of her most trenchant pro-EU critics, notably Tony Blair, cited above, who not only advocated British membership of the euro when it was still a proposal, but who continues to argue for it now that the euro is visibly wreaking havoc across southern Europe. Act of folly does not seem a sufficiently harsh description of such rigidity. Now, why did she, looking just at her record for a moment, why did she move in the direction she did on Europe? I have in the past said I've thought that she started out as an unenthusiastic supporter of Europe and that she gradually became more critical. And that's largely but not wholly true. She was not an unenthusiastic supporter of Europe from the middle to the late 70s. After the referendum that assured Britain's continued membership of the EU, practical politics made it clear that she would have to support it even if she didn't like it, and she did. But the Cold War meant that she was very concerned to try as far as she could to improve and increase European cooperation. She gives, in 1977, for example, it's one of many examples, she gives a speech in Rome. She visits Aldo Moro, later, of course, murdered by the Red Brigades, who was the leader of the Christian Democrats. She urges that all the conservative parties and liberal parties in Europe should unite against the left and produce a common platform in the struggle to keep the Soviets at bay and to maintain NATO and the American connection, and particularly to install US missiles. She actually also wanted a close cooperation between the Italian Christian Democrats and the Conservative Party, which Moro quite liked, but which will amuse critics of David Cameron, because of course it was he who left the EPP later on. Anyway, she wanted, as I say, closer cooperation, and this view of Europe, namely, in the Cold War, we have to have the maximum cooperation between the European countries. This was a major part of her thinking, I would say, right up to the moment when the US missiles were finally and successfully installed and the peace movement had been defeated. And that Cold War objective having been gained, she was then able to take a colder and more critical look at the relations between Britain and the European Union on other questions. And from that point on, we have a series of decisions in which she finds herself more and more critical of the loss of sovereignty to the EU. I'll give you three quick examples. One is, of course, her long campaign, successful, to get more of Britain's money back in the form of a rebate from the European Union. We were a major contributor, but we gained very little from EU spending, so she wanted a rebate back. She got it, and she got twice as much in the rebate as the Foreign Office had thought was possible. Secondly, she signed and supported the Single European Act. But as Sir Noel Malcolm pointed out at the time in The Spectator, she yielded some sovereignty because she thought that this was the price to pay for getting European markets, particularly in France and Germany, open to service industries. The demand from Britain that European markets should open to British service companies is made again and again, and yet it very rarely happens. He felt, Noel felt that in fact, she herself said later, that she regretted having made that concession, and it weakened her later. And the third element, of course, is the European realignment mechanism, which was the ante-room to membership of the euro, and which she was strongly opposed to because it meant maintaining a fixed exchange rate in relation to Germany and the other countries. She was against this on two grounds. First of all, she felt you can't buck the market. If the market wants the exchange rate to go up or down, it's going to force that, whether you're in a European organization or not. And secondly, she didn't want to be in a European system, which meant that the British government would lose control over whether it could change the policy. Well, she was in effect pushed shortly before she left office into agreeing to go in, but 3 years later, Britain crashed out of the ERM, crashed out of the fixed exchange rate, and after a period of having a serious recession, the British economy immediately recovered. So these were all factors which made her more skeptical towards Europe, and which also made her look more prescient again than her colleagues. Excuse me a second, yes. In other words, she gradually, increasingly reached Eurosceptic conclusions, beginning with the ERM and the euro, and then more broadly looking at other elements of Britain's European relationship. She did this in her retirement, and she took time to do so. As a practical politician, she had always been a work in progress, feeling her way in new policy areas. But as she became more confident on an issue, making judgments that were generally consistent with all her other political instincts, she became more daring. Although she changed her mind on particular European issues, however, she didn't zigzag on Europe. There is a clear trajectory in her career that takes her from support for the euro in the 70s through growing disenchantment with its prime minister to later severe criticisms quoted above. She moved consistently, if erratically, in a Eurosceptic direction, and there is no indication of any reverse movement later. The more she encountered the European Union, the more suspicious of it she became. It seemed to her to concentrate the centralizing and leveling passions in one vast bureaucratic machine, insensitive to the sovereignty of nations and to the aspirations of citizens. Above all, she believed it simply didn't suit the British, who had grown up under different institutions and with a different social outlook. Disappointed Remainers, currently comforting themselves that the clever people voted to stay in the EU, and it was mainly uneducated people who opted to regain Britain's independence, should perhaps reflect on the relative reputations today of Thatcher and Blair, and on the reputations of Blair's heirs in the modernising wing of the Tory party. It is now clear that they got Britain wrong, and Thatcher got her country right. What is more, she got the EU right too. Indeed, she got Britain right because she got the EU right. She recognised that the pragmatic British would never feel comfortable inside its centralised bureaucratic structures, with its over-regulation, grandiose ambitions, and lack of democracy, and that these failings would get worse and more intrusive over time. Well, they did get worse, and the Brits voted out. Brexit, it seems to me, repairs the largest single hole in her reputation and tears several holes in the reputations of her rivals in all parties. Today, the question is not why did she get it right, but also why did all of them get it so wrong. I began by pointing out the large number of literary, historical, and other creative works that have been devoted to Margaret Thatcher's life and political life. Let me end by acknowledging that many of them are deeply critical of her achievements, just as many others celebrate those achievements. She's a figure who attracted political criticism in life and who attracts historical controversy following her death. This is inevitable. It is how history works. In his fine and generous parliamentary tribute to Neville Chamberlain, Winston Churchill made this point very firmly, but he also drew a moral from it. I quote, "In one phase, men seem to have been right. In another, they seem to have been wrong. Then again, a few years later, when the perspective of time has lengthened, all stands in a different setting. There is a new proportion. There is another scale of values. History, with its flickering lamp, stumbles along the trail of the past, trying to reconstruct its scenes, to revive its echoes, and to kindle with pale gleams the passion of former days. What is the worth of all this? The only guide to a man is his conscience. The only shield to his memory is the rectitude and sincerity of his actions. It is very imprudent to walk through life without this shield, because we are so often mocked by the failure of our hopes and the upsetting of our calculations. But with this shield, however the fates may play, we march always in the ranks of honour. That about Chamberlain. If we apply this test to Margaret Thatcher, I think she emerges from it with the greatest credit. Her fiercest critics have never denied her sincerity, her patriotism, her belief in freedom and opportunity, not only for the British people, but also for people behind the Iron Curtain and in the Third World. She fought long and hard for what she believed. She changed things. However we may view her achievements, she herself marches, one might say, in the front ranks of honour. But there's another inevitable test. How do her achievements seem in retrospect? Do they shine brilliantly? Have they been diminished by later events or by the effective criticisms of biographers and historians? Here are some remarks by Georges Clemenceau, great French leader of the First World War, might perhaps guide us. Some years after the Great War, Clemenceau was discussing it with a young historian who warned him that later historians, having looked through the archives and reviewed evidence afresh, would develop different perspectives on the war, how it had been waged, and they would reach very different views to those of the Tiger, as he was known. Yes, replied Clemenceau, historians will say many things that run counter to my own views on the war, but one thing they will not say. They will not say that Belgium invaded Germany. Likewise, historians will say many things about the remarkable career of Margaret Thatcher, both here and outside. Some favourable, some critical, but there are several things they will not say. They will not say that she lost the Falklands War. They will not say she played an insignificant role in the peaceful freeing of millions from communism. They will not say that she presided complacently over the continued decline of her country or of its absorption into another state. They will not say that she left Britain poorer and weaker. In fact, their sharpest criticisms will all be glosses on how well or badly she achieved the opposite of these failures. And that is why I think she rests in peace. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much to Gary and everybody at the University of Richmond for having us all here. It's a delight to be present with you today. I wanted to talk a little bit about what I think Mrs. Thatcher's principal impact on the United States was. And certainly, as John O'Sullivan has just demonstrated and other speakers as well, the relationship between Mrs. Thatcher and both Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, the presidents whose terms she mostly overlapped, was close. They had many dealings together on international affairs. Their economic policies had many similarities. But I think in light of history, since the end of her tenure as prime minister, we can say that the predominant influence she had on America was in helping us refocus on the issue of sovereignty, of who governs, of who do we want to be in charge. And this comes to us mostly through the record of her evolving understanding of the European Union and Britain's relationship with the European Union. And again, John, I think, really laid out the history and trajectory. Her opinions did change, but always in one direction, and they changed based on experience. Even after leaving the prime ministership, she saw the continued problems of the European Union, how it affected Britain, and why ultimately, although she may never have said so publicly, she felt that Britain had to leave the European Union, which objective was achieved at least in principle, on June the 23rd of last year by a majority vote of the British people. An astounding day in contemporary history. As other speakers have said here, a result that flies in the face of elite opinion in Britain, in Europe, in the United States. Now, what this long intellectual progress says to the United States is obviously in a somewhat different context. We never had any desire to join the European Union or any prospect that they ever would have let us in, thank God. But we had a global responsibility, and the issue that confronts the United States today, as it has in decades past, is what America's place in the world as a whole is. Now, certainly there are continuing debates about this in Britain, even after the referendum. There's a long negotiation process to get out. Die-hard Remainers are still fighting the fight. And in the United States, there's no victor in the political and intellectual debate about what America's place in the world is or how our sovereignty is affected by international treaties and international organizations that we belong to. We can see this clash really right up at the time of the referendum in Great Britain, when Barack Obama, then president, goes to the UK a few weeks before the referendum and says, "Now look here, you peasants. If you vote to leave, you've got to renegotiate a trade relationship with the United States, and you will go to the back of the queue." Now, that's obviously a British phrase, not an American phrase, but it's also significant when you consider the racial implications of that, from our first African-American president, whose fellow black Americans were told to go to the back of the bus during the days in segregation. I thought it was a stunning phrase for him to use. Whereas at the same time, the unlikely, erratic Republican nominee for president is opening another golf resort in Scotland and allows, as he thinks, the Brits ought to vote to leave the European Union, the sooner the better. And not only did the British people vote to leave the European Union, the American people elected Donald Trump. What is wrong with this? Who allowed these people to vote, for God's sakes? What have we unleashed here? So the debate continues in both countries, and I just, if you look at the progression of history, though, Margaret Thatcher's thinking on sovereignty found fertile ground in the United States, where, for a lot of reasons, the United States over the years has tended to prize sovereignty more than our friends in Europe. I think these historical reasons are important, but I firmly believe if Mrs. Thatcher had not been making the case against Britain's submergence in the European Union as effectively as she did, and influencing American opinion as we looked at the U.S. place in the wider world, we wouldn't see some of the things we've seen in American foreign policy, and we would not be able to predict what would have happened in terms of our relationship with the world. Now, the first thing I think we need to do is define what we mean by sovereignty. And there I think Britain does stand in a somewhat different place than the United States. After all, they have a sovereign. Not without much power these days, but it's one of the reasons why in Europe, I think, and in academic circles in this country, when you hear people say that the world's problems are common and therefore we need common global solutions, we need to pool sovereignty or share sovereignty. That's one of the critics of Mrs. Thatcher John quoted, talked about pooling sovereignty. It doesn't sound terribly dramatic. It doesn't sound like you're giving anything up. It's a kind of abstract concept out there that isn't going to affect you that much, especially given the purported benefits of having global solutions. I think in America, sovereignty has always been much more personal, much more self-evident to the people, because we say in the first three words of the Constitution where sovereignty lies: we the people. So in America, when you hear the advocates of global governance talking about pooling or sharing sovereignty, the American people say, wait a minute, what do you mean? We don't have enough control over our own government as it is. You want us to give up some of that control to some international body where we're going to have even less? It's just not an appealing argument. And although at the turn of this century, people might have said that debate was headed in the other direction, I don't think it's the case anymore. There was talk, and there still is, in the American context, not of the European Union, but of global governance. And it sounds like very benign sort of development. Some 20 years ago now, a book was published called Our Global Neighborhood. Doesn't that sound sweet? Just like Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, Our Global Neighborhood, where they define global governance. And they say, and I quote, "It's part of the evolution of human efforts to organize life on the planet. And the process will always be going on." That sounds to me like the global definition of the European Union. And if you don't like your life being organized, then maybe you're a little skeptical of it. In fact, I would argue that if you look at the theories of global governance that have been espoused over the past several decades, almost without exception, they have originated in Europe or in academic circles in this country that look to Europe for its inspiration. That what was going on in the context of the European Union was seen, not immediately, but at some stage in the future as the plan across the world. And I think the reasoning in many respects is the same. There is a view of the European Union, a very false view, I think, that the solution to the problem of war that racked the European continent twice in the 20th century was excessive nationalism. And that if we could eliminate excessive nationalism, we would eliminate war. So one way to eliminate excessive nationalism is eliminate nations. And despite the fact that at the beginning the European Union, starting with the Treaty of Rome, was called the European Community, it was a free trade area, the European Common Market it was called. In this country, it's a phrase that stuck even as recently as 15 or 20 years ago. You could have members of the House and Senate still talking about the European Common Market, as if that's what it still was, even though it steadily moved with one more community after another being created until it became the European Union. Even then, it didn't strike Americans as terribly problematic. After all, in years gone by, people had talked about the United States of Europe. Well, we've got a United States of America. Sounds like a pretty good idea, unless you ignore a couple thousand years of history that led Europe to the place where it is rather than the United States. But the point is that these theories about what the European Union was up to were seen to be applicable internationally. And many Europeans were not embarrassed to tell us that. The president of the European Council, Herman Van Rompuy, said just at the beginning of the Obama administration that 2009 was the first year of global governance, with the establishment of the G20 in the middle of the financial crisis. The climate conference in Copenhagen is another step toward the global management of our planet. By God, just like the European Union has this management of Europe down pat, we're going to spread this idea around the world. So I see this thinking within the European Union as something directly applicable to the American circumstances in the larger world, and I see Mrs. Thatcher's critique of the European Union expressed over time with increasing specificity and force as directly relating to how we could approach the comparable problem at a broader level. And this is something that applies, and Mrs. Thatcher saw as well, applied across a range of international organizations for Britain. Unlike many Americans who still see all international organizations as essentially the same thing, she saw that they were different, that they had different implications for British sovereignty as they do for American sovereignty. NATO is a different kind of organization than the European Union, and both are different from the United Nations. She was content, in the case of the Falkland Islands, for example, to seek UN Security Council resolutions that authorize Britain, basically in the exercise of their Article 51 inherent right of individual and collective self-defense, to defend their sovereignty over the Falklands. And that actually lasted for 2 resolutions. where the UK was able to get majorities in the Security Council. In fact, it lasted right up until the Argentinian allies, Spain and Panama, supported by Russia and China, pushed a resolution that basically would have put the United Nations right in the center of resolving the conflict, which was met by a US and a UK veto, which brought to a quick halt the idea that the United Nations was going to really contribute to the resolution of this problem. This question of who has authority to initiate the use of force is something that goes right to the heart of sovereignty. I don't think Mrs. Thatcher ever had the slightest doubt that whatever was happening in the Security Council in New York, she was going to maintain British control over the Falklands. This is something that even in her last days as Prime Minister, I guess she didn't know it at the time, but after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait in August of 1990, she had the famous conversation with George H.W. Bush, which actually both sides in this conversation denied, which I believe is true. And even if it's not true, I believe it anyway, because it's too good to miss. When in discussions with President Bush and National Security Advisor Brent Scowcroft, detecting some concerns about the strength of their resolve, she said, "Now, George, don't go all wobbly on this," which ultimately he did not, even though she was, as they say in Britain, defenestrated by her party and removed from office. But the issue of whether there has to be deference to the Security Council, whether a country that doesn't so clearly have the inherent right of self-defense to invoke can act on its own, remains a very important division. And after she left office and after Bush left office, this was tested in Europe in the breakup of Yugoslavia in the late 1990s, when NATO was considering an air campaign to stop Serbian depredations in Kosovo and to try and bring the wars of Yugoslav separation to a halt. It was going to be impossible, clearly, to get a Security Council resolution because the Russians were going to veto any effort to authorize outside interference. NATO went ahead anyway. I think that was the right thing for NATO to do, given the circumstances. But when you have in mind subsequent debates about U.S. involvement in Iraq, in the Second Persian Gulf War or elsewhere, and the argument about why we could only act with a Security Council resolution, remember Tony Blair and Bill Clinton leading the air attacks against the Serbs with no Security Council resolution at all. And this issue is not one that's going to go away. The division over where the source of authority for the use of military force comes from is one that's deeply embedded in some circles in Europe and the United States, and so is the opposition. Listen to what Kofi Annan said when he heard NATO was going to ignore the Security Council. He said, "Unless the Security Council is restored to its preeminent position as the sole source of legitimacy on the use of force, we are on a dangerous path to anarchy." Sole source of legitimacy. Well, you can bet that Mrs. Thatcher would have rejected that, did reject it at the time, as did her government and the U.S. government. But Annan went on to say, only the UN Charter provides a universally legal basis for the use of force. And I think that's something else that she would have rejected. In fact, you know who else rejected it at the time? Joseph Biden, later Vice President of the United States, who said, and I quote, "Nobody in the Senate agrees with that. Nobody in the Senate agrees with that. There's nothing to debate. He is dead flat, unequivocally wrong." It is a statement that an over-exuberant politician like I might make on another matter, but I hope he did not mean it. If he did, I love him, but he's flat out wrong. So this is an indication, I think, of where Mrs. Thatcher's view, and it has historical precedents in both Britain and America, really emerges, and the idea of how Britain plays a role in the world and how America plays a role in the world are influenced. It arises in any number of other contexts. In, for example, the case of international judicial tribunals that purport to bind nation states, and particularly when they purport to bind nation states, the citizens of nation states, not state versus state litigation, but courts like the International Criminal Court, like the European Court of Human Rights, that assert that they can dictate to the citizens of member governments and to the governments themselves of how their citizens ought to be treated. I think the European Court of Human Rights and legislation that flowed from that and from that court's decisions in Brussels was a powerful motivating factor in the referendum for Britain to leave the European Union. I think you can see this in a whole variety of other areas as well. It plays out in discussions today about how best to deal with international terrorism. Is that something for the European Union to deal with, or is that something for NATO to deal with? If we're going to rely, and our European friends are going to rely on the European Union, that's a serious problem for us, because it's proven itself so ineffective over the years. And yet NATO obviously has its problems as well. I think Mrs. Thatcher's choice would have been unequivocal. I think she would have looked to NATO as the preeminent political military body to preserve European security, North Atlantic security, not the European Union. But in a whole range of other ways, one might think that Mrs. Thatcher's critique of the European Union doesn't really apply to the United States, because after all, the European Union was intended to take on many, many issues that we would consider issues that should be resolved by domestic political debate, issues that should be resolved entirely at the national level, when in fact, as I noted earlier, one of the central purposes for the European Union, at least in the eyes of many of its advocates, is precisely to erase national differences and have uniform European-wide rules on a whole range of issues. But the fact is, in the last 20 to 25 years, across the world, there are a whole range of people who think indeed these, what we see as domestic issues, should absolutely be decided in international fora, that they should be taken out of the hands of decision makers in nation states and should be discussed in really at a global level. And you can see this in a range of issues, all of which I think constitute threats to U.S. sovereignty and to the sovereignty of Great Britain and others. I referred to the Copenhagen environmental negotiations a few minutes ago. Now we've got the Paris agreements, which if implemented, which they will not be in this country, would transform economic and regulatory structures in fundamental ways. And yet that agreement was never intended to be a treaty. It was never submitted to the United States Senate. It was purely an executive agreement. Despite the incredibly significant domestic implications it would have, as would a common EU environmental position. You can see efforts by organizations like the United Nations, as the EU has sought to find sources of revenue to fund their activities that are not dependent on national decisions. The biggest constraint that the UN faces financially is the threat of America withholding its contributions, which we're about to do under President Trump's most recent budget. And I could go on at some length on my view of how the only time we ever get listened to in the United Nations is when we threaten to withhold our money. That's why people like Gordon Brown came up with a tax on international banking transactions, why people have proposed taxes on international air travel, the revenues from which would flow directly to the United Nations. That is to say, taking the decision about the level of American support out of the hands of the United States government. Funding for the Law of the Sea Treaty, for example, if we were ever to get into it, would be based on revenues from undersea mining, again, not by government contributions. And that's a significant factor in determining the amount of authority that the European Union has. I think a real reason why there's such discontent with it before the vote in Britain and really around the European Union. But it goes beyond economic issues too. In the international sphere, there are people who want to have international agreements that regulate the ownership of firearms in this country. They want international standards that determine whether there will be a death penalty in this country. They have views on family issues like abortion and what should be legal and what should be not. Now, you can take, in my view, whatever view you want on the death penalty, gun control, abortion, for them or against them. To me, the issue here is who gets to decide that? Do we get to decide that, or do international organizations get to decide that? I think the view Mrs. Thatcher came to increasingly that informed this debate in the United States is that, you know, actually the people of Britain are capable of making these decisions on their own. They don't need the Germans to explain what they're supposed to do. They resent it when a distant authority makes these decisions, and they particularly resent it when this distant authority makes these decisions with almost no transparency, no potential for popular intervention, bureaucrats and diplomats deciding them in conference rooms in Brussels that nobody can get into, and then coming back to national parliaments to be adopted without change because that's your obligation under the various European treaties. And they just saw it grow over time, as she saw it grow over time. The consequences of decisions that she might have thought were correct when taken were revealed as increasingly damaging to Britain and to British sovereignty. And James Madison saw it in 1788 when he said, "There are more instances of the abridgment of the freedom of the people by gradual and silent encroachment of those in power than by violent and sudden usurpations." And that's what was happening in the European Union. That's what could happen in the pursuit of global governance. So now I think what happened on June 23rd in Britain is a fire bell in the night for those who think that the European Union was marching on an inevitable path toward creation of one European state. That's obviously not going to happen. It was a signal to us. And now we've got an incredible opportunity to apply Margaret Thatcher's principles in the next couple of years, because there does need to be a new relationship, certainly on economic and trade issues, between the United States and the United Kingdom. I think it's a great opportunity for the United States Trump administration to show what it means by its trade policy, and a great opportunity for Britain to write almost on a blank slate a free trade agreement that would give them at least a declaration of principles that would give Britain leverage in its exit negotiations with the European Union. So all of this, although it may seem abstract and intellectual, this contribution by Margaret Thatcher has really been profound because her devotion to British sovereignty and the conclusions that flow inevitably from her arguments over the years have brought victory, posthumous victory in the withdrawal of the United Kingdom from the European Union, but victory for her principles, and I hope they succeed here as well. Thank you very much.
We now have about 25 minutes for questions, so just catch my attention. I'll bring you the microphone.
To get the ball rolling, could I ask John O'Sullivan, how did Mrs. Thatcher allow herself to be outmaneuvered on European issues by Geoffrey Howe and Michael Heseltine? She seemed to leave office, it seemed to me, in her leaving office, she was actually more dignified and popular in doing so. Her last speech in the House of Commons, I thought, was a masterpiece. And she, in the middle of it, those who didn't hear it, she suddenly turned to the House and said, "I'm enjoying this, I'm enjoying this. And if you can enjoy your resignation, that's quite something." But how did she allow herself to be maneuvered into that position when her going might have been better managed?
Well, I think because she was less concerned about her going than about establishing that there now had to be a firewall of resistance to any further loss of British sovereignty to the European Union. Remember, I think she'd just returned, had she not, from Rome, where the plans put forward for what later became Maastricht were, in a sense, were presented, and she rejected them. And when she came to the House of Commons, she said that we couldn't have a situation in which, in effect, the Commission is the government of Britain, the Parliament is the Parliament of the European Assembly, is the Parliament of Britain, and I forget what role she was establishing for. Council as the Senate, exactly. She was not prepared to endorse this. Now, the Conservative Party at that time had leadership really since Macmillan and Heath, who, except for her, were firmly committed to the idea that Britain's future lay in the European Union, and that increasing integration was an inevitable part of that, and that we had to, in a sense, persuade people to accept that the European Union had evolved into something much more than the free trade area the British people thought they had voted for in 1975. Obviously, at the top, the reason why she had not confronted this before was because, after all, she had been dealing with so many much larger issues, or much more immediate issues, I should say. You don't choose, if you're a prime minister, you really don't choose the issues you're going to have to deal with. If the Falklands are invaded, you have to handle that now. If the Soviet Union is trying to prevent missiles being installed in Western Europe, you have to handle that now. If the British economy needs to overcome both poor industrial performance on the one hand and the linked question of trade union rights on the other, you have to deal with those things now. Europe was something that was not a pressing problem until I would say the Single European Act. That was the high point for her, I think, of her European support. She looked at what she'd done there. She sacrificed a degree of sovereignty by accepting qualified majority voting, and she didn't get the reward in the form of greater access for British companies to service markets in Western Europe that she thought she would get. And I think that was the way, and so as she got more and more concerned and more vocal in, for example, her Bruges speech, in which she said, "I do not intend to have rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain only to see them reimposed by the European Union." And when the Labour Party switched to supporting the European Union in a major way, which previously it had been against, then this suddenly called into question the whole direction of Conservative policy on Europe since Macmillan. And she was the only one who had the vision to see it clearly. There were a lot of people on the backbenches who shared that view, but the leadership of the party just thought, as I explained, in my talk, that that this was simply fanciful nonsense and nothing could be done about it. That was the background against which the cabinet, in effect, was happy to see her go and smoothed her way out. It didn't produce as what they thought it would, which was a Tory party united around a commitment to Europe. On the contrary, it produced a 20-year civil war, which has only now been resolved by the Brexit vote. I think it has been resolved, incidentally, and we're not likely to see the revival of it of Europeanism within the Conservative Party in any serious way. But having said that, she was the victim of many things, but one of them was the number of issues that just come at you in politics and which you have to deal with, even if you think that even if there's a longer run subversion of your position, you never manage to get round to it.
Just one point, if I could add to that very quickly. It is also the case in decision-making positions. You don't have as much latitude as you might like to have, especially when your bureaucrats are telling you don't have any latitude. And when I first went up to the United Nations in 2005, the British ambassador, Emmer Jones Perry, took a moment to explain how he and others had manipulated Mrs. Thatcher. I don't know why he was telling me this, but how they had put her in various positions where her options were limited. She could only see one or two or three things she could do. And even if her advisors are saying, but that's not true, you got this, you can do that, when the weight of your bureaucracy is pushing you in one direction, and they've got piles of papers and whatnot, and your advisors are also pulled by other priorities. Never underestimate the power of the bureaucracy to box somebody in. So freed from that bureaucracy, she was more of a free thinker.
Other questions?
Yes, a question for both of our speakers. Would you elaborate on why Margaret Thatcher opposed the reunification of Germany, and how did that play out with America too, as far as our position?
Well, I'm sure John will want to comment on this too, but at the time, as the Berlin Wall came down and the Warsaw Pact was collapsing, and ultimately the Soviet Union itself collapsed, German reunification was a particular priority for the United States because of the implications it had for NATO in the rest of Eastern and Central Europe. You really couldn't do much strategic planning until you knew what Germany's status would be. So I would say, and welcome contradiction by others in the room, I would say the biggest advocate for German reunification in the world was the United States. The West Germans weren't terribly enthusiastic about it because they thought it was going to cost too much. The Russians certainly were not enthusiastic about it, nor were the French, thinking, how many times are we going to go through this? And I think Mrs. Thatcher wasn't terribly enthusiastic for the same reason. Memories of World War II were more imminent and more painful in Europe than they were in the United States. But it was very clear that we weren't going any further until we got a reunified Germany. And I think inevitably, whatever the great powers were thinking, we had what we called the 4+2 mechanism to talk about the reunification of Germany, the 4 occupying powers and the 2 Germanys. East Germany was collapsing. It was disappearing right in front of us. I was in East Germany in early September of 1990 as it prepared to disappear, and it was clear once that wall came down, the 2 Germanys were going to be reunited. Going to be reunited prudently and carefully, or imprudently and uncarefully, but they were moving in that direction. So I think it was more a case of managing what was inevitable. But I do think there's no doubt the United States wanted to get it done because it was one more problem ticked off. Germany reunified. Next month we can have another conference to talk about reunifying Korea, one of my objectives, but it was an unnatural division. In 1945 it was going to happen, and when communism collapsed, it did happen.
Yeah, well, I largely agree with that. And indeed, Mrs. Thatcher, in her own memoirs, says that her policy on German reunification met with unambiguous defeat. She acknowledged that. I think it's interesting to compare her attitude to 2 things. On the day that the Berlin Wall falls, she is on television and radio welcoming the spread of freedom to the, particularly to Eastern Germany, but to the Eastern Bloc in general. She was more enthusiastic about welcoming that than I think any other Western leader. I mean, everybody came round to it, but she was out there saying, this is wonderful news. What followed, in my view, inevitably from the wall coming down and was exactly what John has just described, the weakening of the regime in Eastern Germany and an upsurge in both sides of Germany of German nationalism, which I think surprised many of the people who experienced it. I mean, most of those people celebrating and wanting to reunite the country would not have known that it would have been their attitude 2 or 3 years before. They just locked away in the back of their minds what the situation was on the other side of the wall. Some, of course, people just resented very bitterly the fact that they'd have a brother or a sister or a mother on the other side of the wall whom they could never visit. Mrs. Thatcher saw half of that. She saw the tremendous opportunity for people to be free and to live in a free Europe. She didn't, I think, follow the consequences and see that Germans would almost certainly want to establish a single Germany again. And she had reasons for not wanting to reach that conclusion, which was she thought that a united Germany would dominate Europe, as indeed it has done. And indeed the problem of Germany, which is it's too big to be just another power, and too small to be a completely dominant power, remains one. I think the Germans are solving it in a way by having a declining population and trying to solve that decline by bringing in people who are not really German and who will complicate their own domestic politics. But it's going to take time. By the end of the century, I think Britain and France will be larger in population than Germany, although all such forecasts should be taken with a pinch of salt. So she was wrong. What happened was inevitable, but she came to realize that, but she was right to point out that United Germany creates problems which we haven't really yet solved.
More questions?
This is primarily directed to Ambassador Bolton, but both of you can chime in on this. It strikes me that the story you're telling is kind of juxtaposing Margaret Thatcher against the European Union. And maybe playing off of Hayek, you could say it's a juxtaposition of law, legislation, and liberty versus regulation, administration, and submission. But there is another kind of voice out there speaking against the kind of international impetus of the European Union and administration. And that involves a NATO member that has for a long time wanted to be part of the EU and has been held out, Turkey. And I'm wondering if, kind of in a comparison and contrast of the basis on which voices are saying, no, Europe doesn't include Turkey, might illuminate in an interesting sort of way the alternative that Thatcher represents in terms of a limitation to the kind of European project, which Ambassador Bolton, I think you quite correctly identify as having a global aspiration.
Well, I think Turkey had very different objectives in seeking membership in the European Union than what Britain and the other Western European members had for obvious historical reasons. I think Turkey is the European response to Turkey and its application for EU membership was not unexpected, and I think Turkey's the feeling among the Turkish people of sort of surprise and dismay that they were being rejected was unrealistic. That said, it highlights a problem because of the cultural differences between Turkey, even before the Erdogan government, and the rest of Europe, and why Turkey was an important NATO member for the entire Cold War, and why it remains important if we can keep Turkey from really heading in an Islamicist direction, to keep them a NATO member. And Vladimir Putin understands that, which is why he's courting the Turks today to try and split them off from NATO. The Turks are going in the wrong direction for a lot of reasons. Erdogan said when he was mayor of Istanbul 20 years ago, democracy is like a streetcar. You ride it to the stop you want, and then you get off. And he is getting off. And he is Islamicizing the country, is rejecting the post-World War I Kemalist constitution. So I think it's radically different circumstances from Britain's view of Europe, but I also think it may indicate that as the European Union encounters more and more difficulties, the continued problems of the euro, which is a nonsensical invention in the absence of a central government, the problems of refugees, which is working its way through the political systems of a number of countries now, and the feeling in many countries, Greece being the best example, that they simply have lost control of their destiny, that the European Union may well become a multi-speed institution, and those that want to become attached to a greater Germany are going to have that option, and those who don't want that will choose some other option.
I'm in agreement with that. I would say John is right to say, of course, that the Turks were unrealistic in thinking they were going to get full membership, ordinary membership of the EU. But it's also fair to say that we kept lying to them about it over about 40 years. And
Europeans lying? Okay.
And so they feel let down. Now, the only kind of European Union which the Turks could become members of with any degree of the Union working or the Turks being happy is one in which it's a very loose-limbed, at most confederal, maybe just a free trade area, but certainly one that doesn't have free movement of labor, which doesn't have judicial institutions which override the Turkish parliament, and so on and so forth. And that European Union has not been on offer. I mean, that's not the way the current leaders of the European Union want to go. And therefore, they found themselves in the position of systematically misleading the Turks and hoping that they would never actually have to make a final decision. I mean, in a lot of policies in Europe are based on the idea of you announce that you will do that eventually, but you never have any intention of doing it. Many countries many countries have policies of always preparing to join the euro, but never actually getting there. I think there's probably some Greek fable that fits that. Anyway, the end result is that I don't believe that there can be a happy outcome in present circumstances. We do have to move towards, and I think this is where America could play a role, encouraging the Europeans to rethink Europe in a way that they have not done. In fact, they've done the opposite. They've encouraged more and more economic integration. What we need now, and political integration, what we need is someone to devise and help and assist and move towards a large Europe with a lot of countries in it, all united in different ways and moving at different speeds. And that is something which the Turks might join. But of course, by now, it doesn't look as though they really want to.
We have time for one or two more questions. Okay, if there are no further questions, in a few minutes we'll break up for lunch, and we'll be returning here at 2 p.m. to reconvene. Please join me in thanking our panelists.
Is there any chance that Americans playing a creative role the kind that they played actually creative, but mistakenly?
Christ, we're responsible for. I mean, the Marshall Plan saying, okay, you people figured out. I don't know. I have a feeling